Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to lesson JAZ.1.2 on jazz articulations. So normally when we're looking at jazz music and we want to say it, rather than saying the rhythm, we will probably say the articulation because that gets us closer stylistically to what's going on with a line. There are four basic jazz articulations that correspond to the four basic articulations that we've already discussed. You have your tenuto, do, your staccato, di, your accent, da, and your marcato, da. So, these literally correspond to what you would do with your tongue as a wind player. Do and da are open. They have a clear start, but then they don't have a clear close. Di and da, you return your tongue to the place it came from, which is very different than what you would expect stylistically from other classical musics. So in an ideal world, all of these, every note would have one of these, you know exactly what to say, but in practice that would become very overwhelming visually very quickly. And in many arrangements, especially older arrangements, those designed for professional players, you're going to see a lot of unmarked notes. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at guidelines for translating rhythms to articulation syllables. So if you have a bunch of eighth notes in a row, some sort of melodic line, probably in saxes, maybe trumpets, possibly trombones if you're feeling a little spicy. Do da do da do da do da. You're going to have a little bit of emphasis on the offbeats like we talked about in the previous lesson, because that's stylistically appropriate. Do da do da do da do da. If it's faster, you're probably going to slur do 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 da, because otherwise you get do da do da do da do da, and it starts to get a little rickety, little square, little unhip, as the kids say. Do 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 da. Lets it be a little bit smoother. At even faster tempos, you might slur groups of three or more eighths, and that would be more dependent on the melodic line. Maybe if it's going do 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 da do do da do do da, you'd want to choose to accent those higher notes, popping out the texture a little bit more. That would be more dependent on context within the piece. If you're playing with others, talking with them, talking with the director, figuring out what you can all do together. So we're going to be looking at a series of guidelines. So any quarter or eighth followed by a rest is typically short, unless marked otherwise. So if all of this were unmarked, this is what you would say. Dit, dit, dot, dit, dit, dot, dot, dit, dot. That was a little weird at the end. Dit, dot, dot, dit, dot. And depending on the line, maybe some of the dits would be dots or vice versa. The only long note in here is the da, because it's not followed by a rest. It's followed by a quarter note. Quarter and eighth notes are not followed by rests. They're typically long. So quarter notes on beat 1 and 3, typically long. 2 and 4, typically shorter. This 2 and 4, you have the hi-hat and the drum set, which is a short sound. Probably want to match that. So do-dit, do-dit, dit, do-dit, dit, dit, do-dit, dit. Note that this last one is short because it's followed by a rest. Oh, past Mr. Clark thought about that hi-hat thing too. That good. Past Mr. Clark knows what he's talking about. I wasn't even looking there. So some exceptions to this rule would be if you have a whole bunch of quarter notes in a row, where you just probably have all of them be a little bit short. Dot, 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 do-dit. Or this characteristic rhythm, da, 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 dit, dit, depending on the line, might be a dot, might be a dit, but this specific rhythm, this is what you would expect. If you have a pair of eighth notes, starting on a rest, followed by a rest, typically do-dit, 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 do-dit. So that would be your typical pair of eighth notes. If you have a quarter note offbeat between two eighth notes, usually going to be short. Or if it's between rests, probably going to be short. If you have some sort of quarter note offbeat business, do da dit, do da da, da dit, da de, do da da do. So all of these offbeats, that's what we're looking at here. Unless it's tied across the midpoint of a measure or a bar line. So do da do da da do da da do da da do dip. So here, it's part of a longer line, tied across the midpoint of a measure, tied across the bar line. We want to keep that going. If you have an entrance on an offbeat after a rest, especially a longer note, it should be accented. So rather than just do, 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 dit, we want to emphasize that offbeat. Da, do, do, dit. Da, dit. Da, 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 do, dit. Down here, group of 3 or more quarter notes, or the equivalent on offbeats, is usually long and accented. And by equivalent, I mean maybe it's notated differently, like eighth tied to eighth or something like that. But do da 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 dit, da 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 dit. And again, this last note before a rest, probably going to be short. If you have an eighth note line, you want to accent the highest notes and any wide leaps. If you have low notes, do da do do, you can kind of swallow them. Doesn't actually have a vowel. Do da do do. Particularly if an offbeat of 2 or 4, characteristic if you're playing that line on an instrument, you would also ghost it. Do da do do da do dit da do da da do 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 do dit. To be clear, not actually looking at the pitches there, more just looking at the articulations, but that gives you the general idea of the line. If you have eighth note triplets, all 3, instead of just do da do da, you'll probably slur to tongue 1 if you have to say it. You say doodle la doodle la doodle la doodle la doodle la doodle la doodle la. But in practice, do da do a do a do do is how you would articulate it on a wind instrument. If you have quarter note triplets, they should be long. This is just showing you here how it breaks down into the eighth note triplets, but do 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 da 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 do da da do da da. Not totally sure. I guess they're saying that this rhythm is basically equivalent to a quarter note triplet where you still want all of them to be long. Do da da do da da. If you have 2/16 followed by a rest, like we said with eighth notes, that was do dit. This is did it, did it, did it, did it, do day, just to get that faster sound in there. If you have a scoop, where this is easier to think about on trombone with a slide, but you can do it on any instrument. But dwee, 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 down for a fall at the end of the note. Down. If you have some sort of ornament, here we have, depending on who you are, you might call it a turn, or I'd probably call this one a turn, that one a flip. You can use dulia to kind of imitate the sound that, all of this is just imitating the sound that you want to create on your instrument. Do, dulia, do, dulia, do, dulia, do, dulia, do. And then this one, do, dulia, do. Sorry. Dulia, do, dulia, do, dulia, do, do. This is not great notation, but sometimes you might see with some publishers a single dotted eighth pair in a string of otherwise eighth notes, and that would indicate a short accented first note. Normally you'd say, if this were all eighth notes, do da do da do da do da do do dit. Here it's asking for da da do da do da do do dit. Da do da da do da da do dit. So that's just kind of saying, hey, you should accent this and make it short. If you invert this, both of them become long. Do da do da do da do do dit. Da do da di da do da di da do dit. So both of them are going to be long in that inverted case. Then the last thing here, we just want to shape dynamics with the line. If it goes up, louder. If it goes down, softer. Long notes, usually you would shape them with a strong accent and a sudden drop, and then a gradual crescendo through to the end of the note. So Here we're following the line. Do da 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 do da. So normally you'd see this note without anything on it, and you'd just be expected to, in the style, put the accent, forte piano even, and then crescendo to the end. Da! With a sudden cutoff like that. So that's what we got going on here with jazz articulations. I will see you next time to talk about some modes.